He wore gold robes and sat on a throne of marble, but beneath those royal garments, his legs were rotting. The stench filled the court, the physicians whispered in Latin, and yet no one dared say the truth out loud. The king was dying from the inside out. For centuries, royalty was seen as divine, chosen by God, set apart from the masses, draped in jewels and ceremony. But under all the gold and silk, there was flesh. Weak, flawed, bleeding, festering flesh. Behind the palace gates and velvet curtains, some kings screamed in pain no servant could speak of. Some queens wasted away, their minds slipping into madness, while court musicians played outside. Some heirs never even made it to adulthood, strangled not by politics, but by the twisted legacy in their blood. This is the part of royal history we weren't taught in school. Not the coronations, the battles, the treaties, but the suffering, the boils, the seizures, the deformities, the blood that wouldn't clot, the sanity that evaporated one cruel day at a time. In this documentary, we will explore 5 of the most horrific diseases that tormented monarchs throughout history. Each one left a mark, not just on the body, but on the fate of entire nations. Dynasties collapsed because of them. Wars were fought because of them, and in some cases, they were passed down again and again like a cursed crown. Let us begin with the disease that haunted one of the most famous royal families of all time, a genetic curse that flowed quietly through the veins of queens and emperors. A sickness that killed boys in silence and changed the course of world history forever. The bleeding curse, hemophilia in the House of Romanov, Russia, 1904. The winter was brutal, but that wasn't what kept Empress Alexandra awake at night. Her son, the heir to the Russian Empire, had fallen while playing. A simple bruise began to swell, and swell, and swell. By morning, the child's leg was purple from hip to heel. He couldn't walk. He cried out in agony, and Alexandra, she knew. Alexei Romanov, the Tsarevich of Russia, had inherited the secret curse of Europe's royal bloodlines, hemophilia. It's a genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A paper cut could bleed for hours. A fall could cause internal hemorrhaging. One wrong move and you die. But this wasn't just a medical problem. In Imperial Russia, it was a political nightmare. The Tsar's only male heir, the future of the dynasty, could be killed by something as innocent as bumping into a table, and no one could know. The truth had to be buried beneath layers of silence, prayer, and desperation. Doctors were powerless. Every injury became a death sentence, and the empress turned to mysticism. 2. Rasputin, the mad monk, and the dying prince. Enter Grigory Rasputin, a mystic, a wanderer, a man with piercing eyes and a reputation for miracles. He arrived at court claiming he could save the boy, and somehow he did. He didn't use medicine, he didn't even touch the child. He simply prayed, whispered, waited, and the bleeding stopped. Some historians now believe that Rasputin unknowingly helped by keeping doctors away, particularly those giving aspirin, a blood thinner. But to Alexandra, it was a sign, a miracle, divine intervention. Rasputin became her obsession, her salvation, and her downfall. The court grew restless. Nobles whispered that Rasputin controlled the empress, and through her, the empire. When World War I broke out, Russia's already fragile monarchy began to collapse. And behind it all, in the shadows of the throne, was a boy who couldn't stop bleeding. 3. A disease that toppled an empire. Hemophilia wasn't unique to the Romanovs. The mutation originated from Queen Victoria of Britain, who unknowingly passed it down to her descendants, many of whom married into Europe's royal houses. It spread like a curse disguised as diplomacy. By the early 1900s, Spain, Germany, and Russia all had royals suffering from it. Queen Victoria was dubbed the grandmother of Europe, but her legacy wasn't just monarchs, it was pain. Unseen, unstoppable, and unspoken. And in Russia, it contributed directly to revolution. The secrecy, the paranoia, the desperation of Alexandra to keep Rasputin close, it all stemmed from her son's disease. When the people finally rose up, they didn't just destroy the monarchy. They executed an entire family. The boy with the bleeding curse was shot in a basement, along with his sisters and parents. The bullet wounds didn't have time to bleed. 4. The inheritance of blood. Hemophilia is a silent killer. It hides until the body is wounded. Then it reveals its true nature, not just in pain, but in power. For the monarchs of Europe, this disease was more than a medical condition. It was a crack in the illusion of divine right. A reminder that no matter how royal the bloodline, it was still just blood. Fragile. Broken. One disease, one mutated gene. That's all it took to turn empires to ash. And yet, this is just the B. Because in the next part, we travel west to a king whose mind unraveled slowly, tragically, and very publicly. A monarch who could not be trusted to rule, to speak, or even to know what year it was. He wasn't cursed with blood. He was cursed with madness. He stared at the walls, laughing, not at jokes, not at anyone, just laughing, then crying, then screaming, then whispering things no one understood. He talked to ghosts, issued royal decrees to empty chairs. Some days, he couldn't stop talking. Other days, he couldn't form a single sentence. This was the King of England, and this was madness. King George III ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth. Under his reign, Britain faced revolutions, war, and transformation. He was supposed to be the symbol of reason, stability, divine authority, but inside his mind, something was unraveling, slowly, irreversibly. This is the story of a monarch's descent into insanity, a disease that didn't just torment a man, but fractured a kingdom. The guards opened the door and stepped back. The stench hit them like a wall, not the smell of death. Death would have been merciful. This was something worse. The king was still alive. Louis VIII lay motionless on the bed. His flesh, once regal, wrapped in ermine and silk, was now sloughing off in layers, rotting while his heart still beat. His breath was shallow, his skin blackened. The room was filled with incense, perfumes, and desperate prayers. None of it helped. This was not just a dying man. This was a king decaying while conscious. And his court had no idea how to save him or how to explain what was happening. In the annals of medieval monarchy, no death was more gruesome, more revolting, or more mysterious than that of Louis VIII of France, the only king remembered as the lion in life and the rotting corpse in death. The ambitious king. Louis VIII was born into the royal house of Capet, one of the oldest and most powerful dynasties in European history. As a prince, he had already made a name for himself by invading England during the First Barons' War and being proclaimed king briefly by rebellious nobles opposed to King John. Though he never secured the English crown, he returned to France as a respected military leader. In 1223, following the death of his father, Philip II Augustus, Louis became King of France. He was strong, charismatic, determined to expand the kingdom, and he wasted no time asserting control over the southern territories, launching a brutal campaign to crush the Cathar heretics in what would become part of the bloody Albigensian Crusade. But just 1 year into his reign, everything began to fall apart. Not politically, not militarily, physically. A sudden collapse. In the late summer of 1226, while traveling back from a military campaign in the south, Louis fell ill. He complained of weakness, then fever, then pain deep in his abdomen, radiating through his limbs. The royal physicians diagnosed him with dysentery, a common but dangerous illness in the medieval world, caused by contaminated food or water. At first, no one panicked. Even kings caught fevers. But then, the smell came. It began as a strange sourness in the air. Then it grew stronger, sharper, unbearable. Even with the windows open, the odor inside the king's chambers made courtiers retch. His sheets had to be changed constantly. Servants lit candles and burned herbs, but nothing could mask the stench of what was happening inside the king's body. Because Louis wasn't just dying, he was rotting alive. The skin begins to peel. Accounts from the time, rare, fragmentary, but haunting, describe the king's skin separating from his flesh, especially on his back and legs. He developed massive ulcers. His body swelled grotesquely. Some described it as leprosy, others as gangrene. Some whispered it was divine punishment for his brutal crusade against the Cathars. Whatever the cause, the effect was catastrophic. Louis could no longer be touched. His own wife, Queen Blanche of Castile, refused to enter the room. Servants were rotated hourly to avoid vomiting. Several collapsed from the odor. His body, though technically alive, was breaking down at the cellular level like a corpse weeks after death. Historians today suspect he suffered from necrotizing fasciitis, a fast-spreading bacterial infection that destroys soft tissue. In modern hospitals, this would require immediate surgery, massive antibiotics, and possibly limb amputation. In 1226, all they had was vinegar and prayer. Verse: Death by Decay. Louis was moved to the Château de Montpensier, where he spent his final days in agony, isolation, and rot. He died on the 8th of November, 1226, at the age of 39. But even in death, he posed a problem. His body decomposed so quickly that it could not be transported to Paris. The royal embalming team refused to attempt the process. They feared the body might burst open en route due to internal gas pressure, a horrifying but medically accurate risk. So instead, they cut him up. In what was then a semi-common practice for kings who died far from home, Louis's body was boiled in wine and herbs to remove the flesh from the bones, a process called mos teutonicus. The flesh was buried locally, while the bones were sent to Saint-Denis, the traditional royal necropolis. The Lion of France was reduced to fragments, his legacy drenched in vinegar and wine. A crown wrapped in linen. The death of Louis VIII was not just a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic emergency. His son, Louis IX, was just 12 years old, too young to rule alone. The regency fell to his mother, Queen Blanche, who fought bitterly to maintain control amid rising noble factions. But whispers of the king's death spread like wildfire. Some claimed he had been poisoned by his own court. Others said it was punishment from God. His grotesque final days became legendary, used by chroniclers and moralists as evidence of divine wrath. No illness, no matter how real or natural, was seen as random in the medieval world. And for a king to rot in his bed, untouchable, unbearable, unspeakable, that had to mean something. What really killed the king? Modern medicine offers possibilities. Necrotizing fasciitis, as mentioned, or perhaps gas gangrene, caused by Clostridium perfringens, a bacterium that thrives in wounds and causes rapid tissue death, producing a foul, gas-filled stench. But others argue it may have been typhoid fever or advanced dysentery, leading to systemic sepsis, essentially, the body turning toxic from within. Whatever the diagnosis, the result was the same. A king who ruled for less than 3 years. A monarch who died not in battle, not from poison, but from the quiet, grotesque betrayal of his own flesh. 7. The crown carries disease. The story of Louis VIII is not well known. You won't see him on lists of great kings or in popular films, but his death remains one of the most horrifying in royal history. It reminds us that no amount of power, wealth, or bloodline can stop infection. That even in castles with golden crowns and velvet beds, the human body can collapse and take empires with it. In Part 4, we shift from the body to the face. A queen with a secret deformity, a condition that made portraits lie, a royal who smiled in public but behind closed doors, wore a mask not for fashion but for shame. A king in decline. It began in whispers. Court physicians noticed George seemed nervous, irritable. He lost sleep, he paced at night. Then he began talking faster, for hours, days. Sentences turned into streams of words, disjointed, erratic, impossible to follow. He spoke nonsense. He barked like a dog. He screamed at servants, then begged their forgiveness. He told people he had committed sins so terrible that God would never forgive him. And once, he mistook a tree for the King of Prussia. and tried to have a conversation. To the outside world, the official story was exhaustion, overwork, maybe grief. But behind closed doors, it was obvious. The king was losing control of his mind, and no one knew how to stop it. 2. The diagnosis no one dared speak. In the 18th century, madness was not a medical condition. It was a moral failing, a scandal, a royal embarrassment. The idea that a king God's chosen could suffer from mental illness was unthinkable. But George III's episodes were impossible to hide. He would go blind for days, babble endlessly, foam at the mouth, refuse to eat, or worse, eat non-food objects, a behavior today recognized as pica, common in neurological disorders. Doctors at the time bled him, restrained him, starved him. They applied leeches, they locked him in dark rooms. One method involved dunking him in ice-cold water again and again in hopes of shocking the madness out of him. Nothing worked. Today, most historians believe George suffered from acute porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system. Symptoms include abdominal pain, hallucinations, paranoia, depression, and confusion. In extreme cases, it mimics schizophrenia. But at the time, there was no name for it, no cure, just shame. 3. The madness becomes political. In 1788, George III's condition reached a crisis point. His madness lasted for months. He couldn't perform his royal duties. Parliament was in chaos. Ministers argued whether to declare a regency, placing power in the hands of his son. But the idea of removing the king, even temporarily, was dangerous. It suggested weakness. It risked rebellion. The government split. Political factions accused one another of betrayal, and through it all, George screamed in Windsor Castle, naked, covered in his own filth, shouting to no one. Then suddenly he recovered. Briefly, he returned to public life. He was hailed as a miracle. The nation celebrated. Bells rang, streets filled with cheering crowds. "Long live the king," they cried. But the disease wasn't done with him. 4. The spiral and the silence. George III suffered at least 4 major relapses between 1788 and 1811, each one worse than the last. His behavior became more erratic, his speech more incoherent, his body weakened, his memory fractured. By the end of his life, he was blind, deaf, and completely insane. He spent his final years locked away in Windsor Castle, isolated from the court, the public, even his own children. He played the harpsichord for hours. He talked to dead people. He believed his wife, Queen Charlotte, was still alive, even after she'd passed. And yet, no one dared remove him from power until it was too late. By 1811, Parliament finally passed the Regency Act, and his son ruled in his name. George III died in 1820, a shadow of the monarch he once was, alone, forgotten, out of his mind. Madness in the royal bloodline. The tragedy of George III didn't end with his death. The British royal family and many of its intermarried cousins showed signs of similar mental health issues across generations. His granddaughter, Princess Charlotte, died young. His great-granddaughter, Queen Victoria, would later pass haemophilia to much of Europe. His descendants included Kaiser Wilhelm, Tsar Nicholas II, and King Edward VIII, each surrounded by scandal, instability, or downfall. Was it madness, genetics, pressure, divine punishment, or perhaps just proof that even the most powerful family in the world was still human? A kingdom on the brink. When a king goes mad, the consequences are not just personal, they are political, strategic, catastrophic. During George's episodes, Britain teetered on collapse, Parliament froze, wars dragged on. The American colonies broke away, and while historians debate how much his illness influenced that moment, one thing is certain. When your king thinks trees are monarchs and ghosts are advisors, your empire is in trouble. George III's madness became legend, referenced in plays, poems, and eventually the Broadway musical Hamilton. But behind the satire is a deeper truth. This was a man who suffered alone, misunderstood, and tortured by his own mind. 7. A different kind of pain. In part 1, we saw how blood could curse a royal family. In part 2, we've seen how the mind itself can become a battlefield where the enemy is invisible and the war never ends. But next, we will descend into something even darker. A French king whose body decayed in real time, whose skin peeled off in sheets, whose subjects couldn't stand within 10 feet without gagging, and yet he kept ruling. Until the stench of death overpowered the perfume of power. The painting was perfect. Porcelain skin, rosy cheeks, a soft smile beneath powdered curls. But what the painting didn't show was the cratered flesh beneath the rouge, the drooping eyelid, the twisted jaw. The queen was beautiful only on canvas. In the courts of Europe, image was everything. A royal's face was not just a face, it was a symbol of legitimacy, of divine right, of perfection. But what if that face was deformed, scarred, broken? In most cases, it was hidden. Through paintings, through veils, through carefully staged appearances, and sometimes quite literally, masks. History remembers the battles, the speeches, the coronations, but it often forgets the bodies behind the power and how those bodies were sometimes considered too shameful to show. Today, we reveal the hidden faces of royalty, those afflicted not with madness or bleeding, but with deformity, and how entire courts conspired to maintain an illusion of perfection, even as the truth lay just beneath the powder. The curse of the Habsburg Jaw. No discussion of royal deformity can begin without the House of Habsburg, the most powerful European dynasty of the 16th and 17th centuries. Their empire stretched from Spain to Austria to the New World, but their faces told a different story. One look at the portraits of Charles II of Spain reveals the truth: an exaggerated lower jaw, protruding lips, sunken cheeks, and vacant eyes, a face not of strength, but of genetic collapse. This was the result of extreme inbreeding. The Habsburgs believed in keeping royal blood pure, often marrying cousins, uncles, even nieces. Over generations, the family tree folded in on itself. Scientists today call the Habsburg jaw a real condition, mandibular prognathism, combined with maxillary deficiency. In layman's terms, the lower jaw juts forward, the upper jaw collapses, and eating, speaking, and breathing become difficult. Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, suffered terribly. He couldn't chew properly. He drooled constantly. He was largely infertile, and he died childless, ending a centuries-old dynasty. His face was not just a deformity, it was a warning. 2. Madame Royale and the hidden smile. Not all disfigurement came from birth. Some came from disease, and some came from trauma. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, known as Madame Royale, was the eldest daughter of Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI. During the French Revolution, her parents were executed, and she was imprisoned for over 3 years in the Temple prison. She was just 14. When she was finally released, her smile was gone. Literally. Rumors swirled that Madame Royale had developed facial paralysis during captivity, possibly from severe stress-induced stroke, untreated infection, or even physical abuse. Her jaw hung limp on one side. She slurred her words. When she laughed, only half her face moved. For portraits, artists were ordered to paint her head turned slightly to obscure the deformity. When in public, she wore a lace veil, even indoors. It was said she refused to eat in front of others. A princess, a survivor, and a woman who could no longer show her true face. 3. The Iron Mask, a royal myth rooted in shame. One of history's most enduring legends is the tale of the man in the Iron Mask, a mysterious prisoner held in absolute secrecy under Louis XIV, his face covered at all times, his identity never revealed. Some say he was a political rival, others say he was the twin brother of the king, but one theory is darker. Some scholars believe the man may have been a deformed royal relative, possibly mentally disabled or physically disfigured, someone whose existence would embarrass the monarchy if revealed. In a world where kings ruled by divine perfection, a twisted face was not just unfortunate, it was dangerous. It could suggest illegitimacy, weakness, or worse, divine disapproval. So perhaps the mask wasn't punishment. Perhaps it was preservation. 4. Smallpox and the royal complexion. Smallpox, the great disfigurer of the ancient world, spared no one. It was especially deadly in royal courts, where crowded palaces, poor sanitation, and constant travel turned them into disease incubators. Queen Elizabeth I of England caught it in 1562. She survived barely, but her face was left pockmarked and scarred. From that day forward, she wore heavy white lead makeup to conceal the damage, the same paint that would later poison her skin and contribute to her death. Later, Peter III of Russia, husband of Catherine the Great, suffered disfiguring smallpox scars that exaggerated his already awkward features. His portraits were retouched, his public appearances limited. When Catherine finally staged a coup, one of her justifications was that he appeared mentally and physically unfit to rule. In the world of monarchs, your face was your claim to power. If the people couldn't look upon you with awe, they might look upon you with contempt. V. The face behind the power. Why were these deformities so threatening? Because monarchy was, at its core, performance. Power had to be seen to be believed. A king with a twisted jaw, a queen with a collapsed face, a prince who drooled and shook and couldn't smile. These things weren't just sad. They were dangerous to the illusion of divine right. So artists lied, writers omitted, doctors whispered, and the afflicted were hidden behind veils, behind doors, behind rumors. We remember the names, but not the faces. V. When perfection was a lie. Today, we understand physical deformity as a medical or genetic reality. But in history, it was a scandal, a secret, a stain. And for royals, whose faces were cast on coins, carved in marble, and etched into legend, the stakes were even higher. They were forced to choose, hide it, or be erased. And so, some wore masks, others wore paint. Some disappeared into private wings of the palace, seen only by doctors and priests. Their stories live on only in footnotes, edited portraits, or hushed accounts from visiting ambassadors. 7. Final reflection. A royal face was supposed to reflect God's perfection, but time and disease cared nothing for that illusion. They carved through skin, twisted bone, left beauty in ruins. From the monstrous jaws of the Habsburgs, to the veiled smile of Madame Royale, to the scarred cheeks hidden beneath white powder, royalty too was flesh. And flesh can rot, flesh can deform, flesh can shame. But in part 5, we return not to the face, but to the mind and blood combined. A monarch so sick, his body attacked itself. A disease that drove him to violent outbursts, monstrous decisions, and a death wrapped in superstition. Our final story is that of a king cursed with madness, poison, and skin that peeled like bark. The final disease may be the most nightmarish of all. He screamed as servants tried to clothe him. "Get away from me," he shrieked. "I am made of glass." The King of France, dressed in robes of velvet, now feared the touch of silk, not because of fashion, but because he truly believed. One wrong move, and he would shatter. This is not fiction. This is not metaphor. This is the story of Charles VI of France, a king who lived in terror of his own body, of invisible assassins, and of flames that only he could see. And it begins not with a single illness, but with a curse that blurred the line between blood, mind, and fate. A promising beginning. Charles VI became king at just 11 years old, after the death of his father, King Charles V. Known initially as Charles the Beloved, he was intelligent, athletic, and admired by the people. In his early years, the kingdom flourished under the guidance of experienced advisors. He led military campaigns, danced at court, and was hailed as the future of France. But in 1392, everything changed. 2. The madness arrives. It started during a campaign in Brittany. The king had been under immense stress. His friend and advisor had recently been stabbed in the street. During a hunt, under sweltering heat, Charles suddenly snapped. He drew his sword and attacked his own men. He killed 4 knights before being subdued. His eyes were wild, his speech incoherent, his body trembled. Then he collapsed and remained unconscious for days. When he awoke, he didn't remember any of it. The court hoped it was an isolated event, but it wasn't. 3. A mind unraveling. Over the next 3 decades, Charles suffered from repeated mental breakdowns. He would go weeks, even months, without recognizing his wife, his children, or himself. At times, he believed he was made of glass, a documented psychological delusion now known as the glass delusion, a rare mental disorder found mostly in European nobles between the 15th–17th centuries. Charles demanded iron rods be sewn into his clothing to protect him from shattering. He refused to be touched. He sat motionless for hours, afraid even of the wind. Other times, he claimed to be St. George, or a wolf, or no one at all. He howled at night. He ran naked through the halls. He forgot his name. He forgot he was king. And France without leadership began to fall apart. 4. Was it madness or disease? For centuries, Charles VI was dismissed as simply insane, a victim of hereditary madness. But modern scholars and medical historians have posed other theories. Schizophrenia fits the timeline and symptoms, including auditory hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions. Bipolar disorder, type 1, alternating between manic invincibility and crushing catatonia. Autoimmune encephalitis, a rare disorder where the body's immune system attacks the brain itself, causing mental, neurological, and physical breakdown. Porphyria, the same disease suspected in George III of England, but there is no definitive answer. Because Charles's symptoms were not just mental, during episodes he developed rashes, fevers, and at times severe photosensitivity. His skin flared red, his joints swelled, he would bleed from the nose or mouth unexpectedly. It was as if his own body was turning against itself. The king was not just losing his mind, he was melting from within. The kingdom falls with the king. A king's body is also his country. While Charles faded into delusion, France plunged into civil war. Nobles fought for power. Factions divided the realm. The Burgundians and Armagnacs spied. England invaded again. The 100 Years' War reignited with ferocity. The monarchy became a puppet. Treaties were signed in Charles's name, while he stared out the window, unaware of the war, the court, or even who he was. One of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe was now ruled by a man who didn't know he was king, and no one dared remove him. 6. A family consumed. The madness did not die with Charles VI. His daughter, Catherine of Valois, married Henry V of England and gave birth to Henry VI, who would also suffer from periods of insanity, including months-long catatonic states. Once again, royal illness rippled across borders, and war followed madness. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, was slandered and accused of infidelity, partially because her husband could no longer function. Charles's illness became a political weapon used by enemies and allies alike. And his legacy? Not the beloved, but Charles the Mad. 7. The tragedy of the divine body. In medieval thought, the king's body was sacred, his blood holy, his mind anointed. But Charles VI's condition shattered that myth. He reminded the world brutally, publicly, that even kings are made of flesh, nerves, and fragile synapses. And when that system breaks, so does the realm it governs. France eventually recovered, but the shadow of Charles's reign haunted Europe for generations. He died in 1422 alone, demented and forgotten by the people who once adored him. His mind never returned. 8. Final reflection. From the bleeding prince of Russia to the rotting king of France. From madness in the mind to deformity of the flesh, these royal diseases did more than ravage bodies. They toppled dynasties, sparked wars, unleashed revolutions. Because in a world where kings were gods, nothing was more dangerous than proving they were human, powerful, terrifying, real. If you thought this was dark, just wait until we reveal what they did to their enemies. In our next documentary, we uncover the most brutal punishments in royal history, from Iron Maidens to boiling alive. Subscribe now to step deeper into the shadows of history.